June 12, 1944. 12:30 hours. Normandy hedgerow country, France. Private Thomas Bennett crouched in a ditch filled with cold water and Norman mud, his Lee-Enfield rifle clutched against his chest. Around him, the sounds of battle. German machine gun fire from the hedgerow ahead, the occasional crack of sniper rounds, the distant rumble of artillery. His rifle was filthy, caked with mud from 4 days of fighting since the landing, its woodstock scratched and darkened by weather and use. It looked, Bennett thought, like something that should have stopped working days ago. 50 yards to his left, American paratroopers from the 101st Airborne were engaged with the same German position. Bennett watched one of them, a sergeant whose name he didn't know, struggle with his M1 Garand, cycling the action repeatedly, trying to clear what was obviously a jam. The American cursed, ejected the en bloc clip, checked the chamber, reloaded, tried again. The rifle still wouldn't fire. Finally, in frustration, the sergeant drew his pistol instead. Bennett worked his own rifle's bolt. Smooth, familiar motion he could perform without conscious thought, after years of training and months of combat. The bolt closed, chambering a round from his 10-round magazine. He acquired his target, a German position visible through gap in the hedgerow, and fired. The Lee-Enfield barked, its report sharp and distinctive. The bolt came back, the spent casing ejected, forward again, another round chambered. Fire. Bolt. Fire. 3 shots in rapid succession, each one aimed, each one placed where Bennett intended. The rifle worked, just as it had worked on the beach 4 days ago, just as it had worked in North Africa the year before, just as it had worked since Bennett had been issued this specific rifle at Depot in England 18 months earlier. It was old technology, a design dating fundamentally to 1895, refined and improved, but essentially unchanged in basic concept. It was heavy. It required manual operation of the bolt for each shot. By every modern standard, it should have been obsolete, but it worked, every time, in every condition. And for Bennett and thousands of British soldiers like him, that reliability mattered more than any theoretical advantage the newer, shinier American rifles might offer. 2 philosophies of war. The difference between the Lee-Enfield and the M1 Garand wasn't just mechanical. It reflected fundamentally different approaches to infantry combat and weapon design. America's M1 Garand, adopted in 1936, represented faith in technological progress and industrial capability. It was semi-automatic, meaning each trigger pull fired 1 round and automatically loaded the next, eliminating the manual bolt operation required by previous rifles. This gave American infantry significantly higher practical rate of fire. A trained rifleman could easily fire aimed shots twice as fast as with bolt-action rifle, and could fire even faster if accuracy wasn't critical. The rifle fed from an 8-round en-bloc clip that inserted into the action from above, automatically ejecting when empty with a distinctive ping that became the weapon's signature sound. The design was sophisticated and reflected American manufacturing advantages. Gas pressure from firing drove a piston that cycled the action, ejecting the spent case and loading the next round. This required precise machining, careful assembly, and components manufactured to tight tolerances. The rifle worked beautifully when everything was perfect. Ammunition dimensioned correctly, action kept clean and properly lubricated, parts maintained within specification. Britain's Lee-Enfield, officially the rifle, number 4, Mk1 by 1941, represented different philosophy entirely. The basic design dated to 1895, though it had been refined repeatedly through decades of service. It was bolt action, requiring the shooter to manually cycle the bolt to eject spent cases and chamber fresh rounds. This seemed primitive compared to American semi-automatic technology, a throwback to warfare's previous era. But the Lee-Enfield's design incorporated decades of practical experience about what actually mattered in combat conditions. The rifle's bolt design was critical. Unlike most bolt-action rifles, which locked at the front near the chamber, the Lee-Enfield used rear-locking lugs. This allowed shorter bolt throw, the distance the bolt had to travel to unlock, extract, and reload. Shorter throw meant faster cycling. A trained British rifleman could work the Lee-Enfield's bolt with remarkable speed, achieving rates of fire that approached semi-automatic weapons under battlefield conditions. The British Army's standard for trained riflemen was 15 aimed shots per minute, 1 every 4 seconds, including aiming time. Expert riflemen could exceed 20 rounds per minute, fast enough that Germans facing massed British rifle fire sometimes believed they were under machine gun attack. The magazine held 10 rounds, rather than the Garand's 8, loaded via 2 5-round stripper clips or topped off with individual rounds. This capacity advantage was significant in sustained firefights, where every round counted. More importantly, the Lee-Enfield could be topped off at any time. A soldier with 3 rounds remaining could load 2 more from a stripper clip without emptying the rifle. The Garand, by contrast, could only be reloaded by emptying the en-bloc clip entirely or by manually removing the clip, wasting unfired ammunition. But the most important difference was simpler. The Lee-Enfield was forgiving. Its chamber was slightly oversized, allowing it to accept and fire ammunition that wasn't perfectly dimensioned. Its manual action meant that cycling didn't depend on gas pressure, so variations in ammunition or fouling didn't affect function. Its simple design meant fewer parts to break or malfunction. It was a rifle designed to work under worst possible conditions, in the hands of soldiers who might not be expert marksmen, maintained in field conditions with minimal tools and supplies, mud and sand and snow. The true test of any weapon is how it performs under combat conditions, and World War II provided every possible test of infantry rifles across every conceivable environment. In North Africa, the desert proved particularly cruel to sophisticated mechanisms. Fine sand penetrated everything, working its way into actions and mechanisms regardless of care. The Garand's gas system was especially vulnerable. Sand in the gas tube or around the piston could jam the action or slow it enough to fail cycling. American troops learned to keep their rifles meticulously clean, a challenging task in an environment where sand was omnipresent and water for cleaning scarce. The Lee-Enfield suffered from sand too, but its manual action meant that fouling might slow bolt operation but rarely stopped it entirely. A British soldier whose rifle action was gritty from sand could still force the bolt through its cycle, chamber rounds, and fire. The oversized chamber meant that even if sand mixed with chamber or ammunition, the rifle generally extracted and ejected without jamming. Maintenance could be as simple as working the bolt repeatedly to wear away accumulation, or running an oily rag through when water and proper cleaning supplies weren't available. British troops at El Alamein in October 1942 fought through sandstorms that made visibility nearly impossible and coated everything with fine grit. Post-battle reports noted that Lee-Enfield's continued functioning with minimal maintenance, while many more sophisticated weapons required extensive cleaning or repair. The simplicity that seemed primitive in peacetime proved invaluable in conditions where sophistication became liability. The Italian campaign introduced different challenges. Winter fighting in mountainous terrain meant cold that froze lubricants and made metal brittle, rain that turned everything to mud, snow that packed into mechanisms. The Garand's gas system could freeze if moisture accumulated in gas tube and temperatures dropped. The N-block clip system sometimes hung up when cold made metal contract and tolerances tighten. The Lee-Enfield worked through Italian winter with the same uncomplaining reliability it had shown in desert. Its manual action wasn't affected by frozen gas systems because it didn't have gas system. Its magazine feeding was simple and robust enough that cold didn't significantly affect function. British troops learned to keep actions lightly oiled in cold weather. Too much oil thickened and could slow bolt operation, but the rifle functioned even when maintenance wasn't perfect. Normandy presented perhaps the ultimate test. Combat in bocage country, where hedgerows channeled movement, where every field became separate battle, where soldiers fought from ditches filled with water and mud. The close-range, confused nature of hedgerow fighting meant rifles were constantly dropped, dragged through mud, subjected to impacts and abuse. Keeping weapons clean was nearly impossible when soldiers were constantly wet, covered in mud, moving through terrain that coated everything with filth. Private Bennett's experience was typical. His Lee-Enfield spent 4 days in conditions that should have rendered any rifle inoperable. Dropped in water-filled ditches, caked with mud, fired hundreds of times without proper cleaning. Each night, he did what maintenance he could with limited supplies and exhaustion that made detailed cleaning nearly impossible. Each morning, the rifle continued working. The bolts cycled smoothly enough despite grit in the action. Rounds chambered and fired without drama. When Bennett squeezed the trigger, the rifle went bang, every single time. Around him, some American troops fought similar battles with Garands that required constant attention. The rifles worked well when properly maintained, but properly maintained was a difficult standard to achieve in bocage combat conditions. Soldiers learned to be meticulous about clearing mud from gas systems, about keeping ammunition clean before loading, about detailed field stripping and cleaning whenever brief pauses in combat allowed. Those who couldn't maintain that standard sometimes found their rifles jamming at critical moments. The pattern repeated across theaters. In Burma, jungle humidity and tropical heat created corrosion that attacked any weapon. The Lee-Enfield's simpler mechanism gave corrosion fewer places to disable function. In the Arctic, temperatures that froze sophisticated mechanisms left the Lee-Enfield still operating. In every environment where warfare's chaos made perfect maintenance impossible, the rifle's forgiveness and simplicity proved valuable beyond any theoretical advantage more sophisticated weapons might offer. The American offer. When America entered the war in December 1941, its productive capacity became critical to Allied success. The Lend-Lease program sent enormous quantities of American equipment to Britain: ships, aircraft, vehicles, weapons, ammunition, supplies of every kind. Among the offerings were M1 Garand rifles, available in quantity as American factories ramped up production. The offer had logic behind it. Britain was producing Lee-Enfields at capacity, but still needed more rifles than domestic production could provide. American factories could produce Garands in vast numbers, supplying Britain's needs while introducing superior technology to British infantry. The Garand was objectively more modern, offered higher rate of fire, and represented latest thinking in infantry weapon design. Accepting American rifles would ease British production bottlenecks while upgrading infantry capabilities. British Ordnance Board tested the Garand thoroughly through 1942 and 1943. They evaluated its accuracy, reliability, maintainability, and suitability for British tactical doctrine. They fired it in various conditions, subjected it to abuse, tested it alongside the Lee-Enfield in controlled conditions and field trials. The testing was rigorous and professional, designed to determine whether adopting American rifle made military and logistical sense. The conclusion was polite but definitive. Britain would continue producing and using the Lee-Enfield. The Garand was acknowledged as capable weapon with certain advantages, but those advantages didn't outweigh the complications and disadvantages that would accompany adoption. The reasons were practical rather than emotional. First, the Garand required different ammunition, the American .30-06 cartridge rather than Britain's .303 British. Switching would require either converting British ammunition production or establishing separate supply chains for American ammunition, complicating logistics that were already strained. Second, the Garand was heavier, about 9.5 pounds compared to the Lee-Enfield's 8 pounds. This seemed minor, but accumulated across infantry battalions carrying rifles through extended operations. Third, the Garand's N-block clip system was less flexible than the Lee-Enfield's magazine, eliminating the ability to top off partially empty rifles. But the critical issue was reliability under field conditions. Testing revealed that the Garand's sophisticated mechanism was more vulnerable to fouling, to damaged ammunition, to environmental extremes. Sand or mud in the action could jam the rifle until cleaned. Dented cartridges that the Lee-Enfield would chamber and fire without issue could hang up the Garand's feeding mechanism. The rifle required more careful maintenance, more frequent cleaning, more attention to keep functioning in conditions where British rifles simply worked regardless of treatment. British tactical doctrine emphasized sustained, accurate fire from trained riflemen rather than volume fire from semi-automatic weapons. The philosophy held that well-trained soldiers with bolt-action rifles could achieve adequate rate of fire while maintaining ammunition discipline and accuracy. The Lee-Enfield's 10-round magazine, rapid bolt operation, and ability to be topped off without emptying fit this doctrine perfectly. The Garand, despite its semi-automatic capability, actually fit less well. Its 8-round capacity was smaller, its feeding system less flexible, its requirement for complete reload before refilling disrupted the fire discipline British doctrine emphasized. The decision wasn't about pride or tradition, though both played roles. It was practical assessment that switching to Garand would create more problems than it solved, that the Lee-Enfield's proven reliability under British tactical doctrine outweighed theoretical advantages of semi-automatic fire, that maintaining existing weapons and logistics made more military sense than adopting new ones mid-war. The human factor. Beyond mechanics and reliability, the Lee-Enfield's endurance in British service reflected human factors that technical specifications couldn't capture. British soldiers trained with the Lee-Enfield from basic training onward. They learned its operation until working the bolt became muscle memory, requiring no conscious thought. They learned its accuracy characteristics, how it shot at different ranges, how to compensate for wind and distance. They learned to maintain it, to field strip and reassemble it in darkness, to diagnose and fix common malfunctions with minimal tools. By the time soldiers reached combat units, the rifle was so familiar it felt like extension of their bodies rather than separate tool. This familiarity bred confidence. A soldier who'd fired thousands of practice rounds through his rifle, who knew exactly how it would respond, who'd maintained it through training and could identify any variation in its function. That soldier trusted his weapon completely. When combat came and chaos overwhelmed everything else, the rifle remained familiar and reliable, an anchor point of certainty in circumstances where little else could be counted on. The rifle also became personal. Soldiers were often issued specific rifles they kept throughout their service, rather than drawing different weapons from pool. They learned their particular rifle's characteristics, how it shot slightly left at long range, how the trigger pull felt, which position the rear sight needed for different distances. Some soldiers carved initials or unit markings into stocks. Others named their rifles or developed superstitious attachments to specific weapons that had kept them alive through multiple battles. This personalization created emotional attachment that transcended rational assessment of weapons technology. A soldier's rifle wasn't just tool, but companion, trusted friend that had been present through combat and survival. Switching to different weapon, even theoretically superior one, meant losing that relationship and familiarity, starting over with unfamiliar tool at time when familiarity and trust mattered enormously. British military culture reinforced this attachment. The Lee-Enfield was the British rifle, symbol of British infantry and their approach to warfare. Soldiers learned traditions about the weapon, stories of previous wars where it had proven itself, tales of exceptional marksmanship or reliability. Officers emphasized pride in British military tradition, in being part of lineage stretching back through previous conflicts. The rifle embodied that tradition, representing continuity with soldiers who'd carried similar weapons at Mons and Ypres, who'd learned same skills and maintained same standards. This cultural dimension wasn't irrational sentiment. Military effectiveness depends substantially on morale and confidence, on soldiers believing in themselves and their equipment, on units maintaining cohesion and identity. The Lee-Enfield contributed to British infantry identity, helped soldiers see themselves as part of tradition of competent, professional soldiers who achieved results through skill and reliability rather than technological superiority. Switching to American rifles would have disrupted that identity for uncertain benefit. The Mad Minute. One particular demonstration of the Lee-Enfield's capability became legendary in British military culture: the Mad Minute test of rapid aimed fire. The test, formalized before World War I, but maintained throughout the rifle's service, required soldiers to fire 15 aimed shots at target 300 yards distant within 1 minute. The standard wasn't merely firing 15 rounds quickly, any weapon could do that, but placing 15 aimed shots on target, demonstrating both speed and accuracy. Expert riflemen were expected to exceed this standard, achieving 20 or more hits in the same time frame. Achieving this required complete mastery of the rifle's operation. The soldier had to work bolts smoothly while maintaining sight picture, to reload rapidly using stripper clips without losing target acquisition, to control breathing and trigger squeeze while operating at maximum sustainable speed. It demanded physical conditioning, mental focus, and hundreds of hours of practice until the actions became automatic. British recruits practiced the Mad Minute relentlessly. It became test of competence, proof that a soldier had truly mastered his weapon. Those who could consistently achieve the standard earned respect. Those who exceeded it significantly, achieving 25 or 30 hits, achieved almost legendary status among their units. The test embodied British military philosophy. Properly trained soldiers with reliable weapons could achieve extraordinary results through skill rather than technology. In combat, this training paid dividends. When British infantry engaged targets, their collective rate of fire was formidable. A section of 10 men, each capable of 15 aimed shots per minute, could deliver 150 rounds per minute on target, equivalent firepower to light machine gun. but distributed across 10 rifles rather than concentrated in single weapon. This distribution made British fire resilient. Losing one rifleman reduced sections' firepower by 10%, rather than eliminating it entirely as losing single machine gun would. German forces facing British infantry often reported believing they were under machine gun fire when actually facing massed rifle fire from trained Lee-Enfield users. The distinctive crack of multiple rifles firing in rapid sequence created acoustic impression similar to automatic weapons. The volume of incoming fire, sustained over extended periods as soldiers reloaded and continued firing, suggested automatic weapons rather than bolt-action rifles. Some German after-action reports noted surprise upon learning British sections had achieved such fire volume with manual rifles, having assumed automatic weapons were responsible. This capability represented British approach to infantry combat, achieved technological effect through training and skill rather than through technology itself. It validated the decision to retain Lee-Enfield despite availability of semi-automatic alternatives, demonstrating that in trained hands, the obsolete bolt-action rifle could match or exceed the practical battlefield performance of more modern weapons. The test of time. Perhaps the ultimate validation of British decision to retain the Lee-Enfield came from the rifle's service life, which extended decades beyond World War II's end. When the war ended in 1945, both British and American forces began evaluating their weapons and planning for future requirements. American military quickly moved beyond the Garand, developing the M14 rifle in the 1950s and then the M16 in the 1960s, each representing new approach to infantry weapons based on lessons from recent combat. The Garand, though successful in World War II, was recognized as interim solution that would be replaced as technology and tactical thinking evolved. Britain, by contrast, continued using the Lee-Enfield as primary infantry weapon through the late 1950s. British forces carried Lee-Enfields in combat operations in Malaya, Kenya, Cyprus, and other colonial conflicts of the immediate post-war period. The rifle continued proving its reliability and effectiveness in jungle warfare, counterinsurgency operations, and conventional combat. Only in 1957 did Britain officially adopt a new rifle, the L1A1 self-loading rifle, a license-built version of the Belgian FN-FAL, and even then, Lee-Enfields remained in reserve and specialist use for years afterward. Even more remarkably, Lee-Enfields continued in frontline service with various Commonwealth nations through the 1960s and 1970s. Canadian forces used them until 1957. Australian military retained them longer. Indian and Pakistani forces, inheriting British military traditions and equipment, used Lee-Enfields as primary infantry weapons through multiple post-independence conflicts. Various police and paramilitary forces continued using the rifle into the 1980s and beyond. This extended service life validated British assessment during World War II. The rifle that seemed obsolete in 1940, that should have been replaced by more modern weapons, proved durable and effective enough to serve through decades of changing military technology and tactics. Its reliability, simplicity, and effectiveness in trained hands remained valuable even as military technology advanced in other areas. The supposed obsolete rifle outlasted the modern weapons that were meant to supersede it, the quiet pride. British soldiers never claimed their rifle was superior to American weapons. They didn't need to. The Lee-Enfield's merit wasn't theoretical superiority, but practical reliability, not impressive specifications, but consistent performance, under conditions where consistent performance mattered most. When British and American troops fought alongside each other in North Africa, Italy, and Northwest Europe, there was no rivalry about weapons. American soldiers with their Garands achieved excellent results. British soldiers with their Lee-Enfields achieved excellent results. Each weapon fit its user's training, doctrine, and expectations. The question wasn't which rifle was better in abstract sense, but which rifle better served the soldiers who carried it. And for British infantry, the answer remained their familiar, reliable, unfailingly competent Lee-Enfield. The rifle embodied British military character in ways that transcended its mechanical function. It was understated, not flashy or impressive in appearance, but solid and dependable. It was traditional, carrying forward design elements from previous generations while incorporating practical improvements. It was professional, requiring skill to use effectively, but rewarding that skill with exceptional performance. It was resilient, able to function in terrible conditions with minimal maintenance, refusing to quit when circumstances were hardest. These characteristics reflected how British military culture understood itself. Professional soldiers who achieved results through training and discipline rather than technological advantage, who valued reliability over innovation, who maintained traditions while adapting to practical necessities. The Lee-Enfield wasn't just weapon, but symbol of this identity, physical embodiment of British approach to military service. When offered American rifles, British soldiers didn't reject them from pride or stubbornness, but from practical recognition that their obsolete weapon actually worked better for them than the superior alternative. The Lee-Enfield knew no peer in mud or sand or snow. It asked only reasonable maintenance and rewarded that with unfailing reliability. It had carried British soldiers through 2 world wars and would carry them through the hard years of Empire's end. It was the rifle that always worked, that never let them down, that proved again and again that sometimes the old, simple, proven solution serves better than the new, sophisticated, theoretically superior one. Private Bennett, crouched in his Normandy ditch with his mud-caked rifle, didn't need theoretical discussions about gas systems and semi-automatic actions. He needed weapon that would fire when he squeezed trigger, that wouldn't jam at critical moment, that he could trust completely, regardless of conditions. The Lee-Enfield was that weapon. It had always been that weapon. And no amount of American engineering, however impressive, could match the simple confidence Bennett felt when he worked his rifle's bolt and knew, absolutely knew, that it would fire. That confidence, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of British soldiers in every theater of war, was worth more than any technical specification could measure. It was why Britain stayed with its obsolete rifle when offered modern alternatives. It was why soldiers who'd carried Lee-Enfields through combat remembered them with affection decades later. It was why the supposedly outdated weapon served effectively through decades after more sophisticated rifles had been replaced and forgotten. The rifle wasn't the most modern. It wasn't the fastest. It didn't have the impressive specifications or the sophisticated mechanisms. But it was British, reliable, professional, understated, effective. And for British soldiers fighting across 6 years of global conflict, that made it exactly the right weapon, the one they'd choose every time over any alternative, however theoretically superior. The old rifle that always worked, carried by soldiers who knew exactly what they could trust, proving daily that sometimes tradition and reliability matter more than innovation and technology. That was the Lee-Enfield. That was its legacy. And that was why British soldiers, offered the choice, always chose to keep it.